I'm Chuck Bolen from Zebra Technologies, and this afternoon I want to talk to you about who Zebra is, what we talk about when we talk about enterprise customers, how we use Android for our enterprise customers, and in particular some of the unique security needs of our enterprise customers, how it affects them, and what Android has done recently to help support enterprise customers for security. So first off, how many people have heard about Zebra Technologies before today? I see one person. Well, the guys in the back that work for Zebra, I would assume you know. So, how many people thought this has to do with animals and you thought this would be a cool presentation in the afternoon? Sorry about that. I actually stole this picture from, I think, the San Diego Zoo or something. But so actually, Zebra Technologies is a company that is an OEM focusing on building rugged Android devices and other devices. About 3 years ago, we were part of Motorola. We were purchased by Zebra Technologies about 3 years ago. Prior to that, we were a Symbol Technology. So we've had a long history in ruggedized mobile computing. When we look at our market, we really focus on four different main verticals. So retail. So how many people, you might not have heard of Zebra, but anybody who's gone into a Home Depot store the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen one of our rugged Android devices being used by their sales associates. Anybody who's had a FedEx package delivered to their house, they're using one of our rugged devices to help track their packages. So we're used by retail companies, transportational logistics like FedEx and UPS, things like that, people delivering Coca-Cola or Pepsi soda, manufacturing companies, warehousing, healthcare, nurses and doctors are using it to scan wristbands for patients and make sure that matches the drugs that patients are given and things like that. So a variety of use cases. We leverage a lot of the same technologies, a lot of the same software and hardware that you might in your consumer cell phone in your pocket, but in a very different form factor. And we have some unique needs that we'll talk about. Zebra Technology overall, the team here today really focuses on mobile computing. That's really focused on Android. We're the number one in our market in mobile computing. We also focus on barcode scanning. As you may see, barcode scanners connected to cash registers and things like that throughout the world. RFID readers, both fixed mount and portable RFID readers, again for business and commercial uses. And then printing. The legacy Zebra, who purchased the mobile computing business about 3 years ago, is in the rugged printing business. Not printers that you'd use on your desk, laser printers and things like that. Label printers that for printing out shelf labels, things like that. The shipping labels that a UPS or a FedEx or an Amazon would use, and then mobile printing. So somebody stocking shelves might print out price labels and things like that. So those are markets that we serve as part of Zebra. Zebra, historically this rugged enterprise market was focused on Windows CE, which is a relatively old operating system, about 15 or 20 years old. Zebra invested heavily, we were, Motorola and Symbol at the time, in Android. So we've been focusing on Android since about 2011. We've released about 20 different products based on Android and a lot more on the way. We have a pretty strong relationship with Google. There's a team at Google that they call the Enterprise Android team that puts extensions in Android to be more manageable and more secure. For enterprise customers, we'll talk a little bit about that. We provide developer kits to help people write applications for the unique hardware in our devices. We've had to make some minor extensions to Android to improve the manageability and security. Again, things that are different from a consumer needs and an enterprise needs. We have what we call our Mobility DNA suite, which is basically a series of utilities for developers, device administrators, and end users. And I realize I spelled administrators pretty horribly there. You can see on the bottom just some of the form factors that we have. Again, most of these don't look like your traditional form factors. Some of them are, ergonomic, somebody in a warehouse scanning packages all day. Another interesting one is the one all the way to the left, personal shopping. The idea is you walk into a store, pick up a device, you start scanning your own items, put them into your cart, and when you're done, you just check out. We've got tablets, we've got devices that a delivery person would use, more of a more rugged type device, mostly with barcode scanners. Most of them can use that in the rain and things like that, drop 6 feet to concrete multiple times, and they'll survive. People look at these things a little bit differently from an enterprise perspective. People call our market, sometimes call it enterprise, sometimes people will call it rugged enterprise. Some people call it COBU, corporate-owned, business-operated, right, as opposed to BYOD, everybody's probably familiar with, bring your own device, where you own your device, you bring it to work and use it at work. The difference here is the corporation owns the device. So, Home Depot owns the devices that they bought, their employees use it. Some people call that corporate-owned single-use or special-use devices. Some of the major differences are, in cases, people are managing a fleet of devices. You and I get a new phone, you got to type in our Wi-Fi passwords and things like that. Okay, takes us 15, 20 minutes, that's no big deal. If I have a fleet of 100,000 devices, that's a pretty big deal. But I got to go to 100,000 devices and configure everything. So, how do we manage things quicker? How do we make it seamless? How do we make it automatic is one of the big areas that we focus on. It's also from a security perspective is you don't want, if somebody had to put the Wi-Fi password in, that means a lot of people have to know the Wi-Fi password to enter it into the device. So we've had to come up with ways to what we call staged devices to make it A, much more efficient, and B, much more secure. Applications are business critical. I mentioned people who are delivering packages with our devices, right? If they can't deliver if their device doesn't work and they can't deliver a package to your house, they can't do their job, they can't make their money. So where you and I, our cell phone crashes, okay, you can't send a text to your friend or post on a Snapchat or something like that. It's inconvenient. But if you can't do your job, that becomes a business critical need. If we're using it in healthcare, it becomes even more important than that. One of the other main differences is decisions are made by the device administrators as opposed to the end user of the device, right? Imagine on your phone, if you want to pair it to a Bluetooth, intentionally it's not allowed that an application could automatically pair without the user intervention, right? Because you don't want to download a game from the Play Store, have it decide it's going to pair to some Bluetooth peripheral and start sending information to who knows where. Right? On the other hand, if you're in a retail store and you don't necessarily want the cashier making that decision and deciding they want to either maliciously or unintentionally, connect to some Bluetooth peripheral and share data that way, that's the administrator who should make that decision. So the same scenario is actually a little bit different depending on who owns the device. In the rugged enterprise space, the administrator should make that decision and control who has access and basically configure the devices appropriately. Ruggedization and stability is a big factor. As I mentioned, these people are using the device all day as a tool, so they have to be rugged both physically, so they can drop them, use it in the rain, but even from a software standpoint, how do we make it more stable? Again, on our personal phone, if 1 in 1,000 days the device crashed, we think that's pretty good, right? I'd be happy if I can go a couple of weeks without it crashing. But imagine if I have 100,000 devices and 1 in 1,000 days my phone crashes, that's a couple of hundred devices a day that are crashing that a company can't do their job on. So that becomes pretty significant. So we do a lot to harden the operating system. We do a lot of stress testing, a lot of stability testing to make sure things are working correctly. Security, these devices are used on corporate networks with corporate assets. So that's why the focus of today's talk is about security. That's a big focus. Becoming more and more important, as unfortunately we see lots more in the news, a lot more sinister people, a lot more people, trying to break in, trying to hack. I'm sure we've all seen those types of things. Manageability, I mentioned, right? The ability to manage a large fleet of devices. Things that you take for granted, you tell a user, just go to this setting and change that. If you got thousands of users, that really becomes, unscalable. I would say if there's a question, yes or no, half the people are going to say yes, half the people will say no. It means half the devices will work, half the devices won't work. Devices are typically used for data capture, scanning barcodes or RFID tags, so we put a lot of focus into ruggedizing and have efficient data capture and barcode scanning. Tomorrow there'll be a session that we'll talk about, Billy in the back, we'll be talking about our developer kits and particularly how do we enable barcode scanning within our applications. Speaking of, we provide developer kits, for a variety of different environments, a standard Java EMDK for Android, one for Xamarin, people who have C# code. We have a JavaScript-based EMDK we call it Enterprise Browser. We have a utility called Data Wedge, which basically makes barcode data look like somebody typed it into the keyboard, so people don't necessarily need to change their application. We have a pretty active developer community. The link is on the bottom, developer.zebra.com. If you want to learn more about our developer kits, the tools and utilities that we provide for our devices, that's the best source of information. It's a pretty active forum, people asking questions and things like that. Sample code, download all our utilities. We provide APIs. Typically, we don't duplicate what Google does. So the Android operating system is pretty robust. We don't try to change any of their APIs or duplicate them. We extend them for things that are unique to our hardware or things that are unique to our market. Things like being able to, talk to our barcode scanner. We've got some unique things for serial ports. Some of the peripherals, believe it or not, are still serial-based. So, in consumer space, nobody's got serial peripherals, so we had to add a serial API. We make it convenient so you can scan a barcode and pair it to a Bluetooth device. So typically people will put the Bluetooth address on a printer, scan the printer, and it'll automatically pair to that printer rather than having to type it in. So we had a lot of convenience features like that. So in terms of device management, I don't know if people have heard a term called Android for Work. Anybody heard of that? Okay, a few people. So starting with Lollipop, Google came out with a feature they called Android for Work. And basically what Android for Work is a standard way for people to manage devices. Prior to that, MDMs are now called EMMs. Every EMM had to work differently for every OEM. Right? So most of the APIs weren't there, so MDM vendors had to write unique versions for each device. They've standardized that with what they were calling Android for Work. Last year they decided to change the name, and they just basically unbranded it because it's really just a feature of Android. People now just call it the Enterprise Android feature set. And it lets you manage the device, and from a security perspective, lets people lock down the device, provision the device. Two main modes of operation. Profile owner mode, which is kind of a bring your own device mode, which basically manages a subset of applications, and device owner mode, which is more focused on our market, which manages the entire device. So that's typically when a corporation owns a device, they want to manage the entire device, not just a portion of the device. Profile owner mode, the idea is you bring your device to work, and you've got some work applications that the IT department wants to manage, and you've got your own personal applications, whether it's Angry Birds or games or whatever you want to do, and they don't want to control your applications. They don't want to control the business applications. So what they do is they segment the applications so they have complete control. They can insist that it's encrypted, the corporate data. They can wipe the corporate data when you want, but they don't want to touch your data. So they basically have a sandbox between what's corporate applications and what's personal applications to manage this kind of dual-use device scenario. Works well when it's a personal device. When the corporation owns the device, that's where device owner mode fits in. Device owner mode really is the corporation owns the device, they manage everything on the device. What applications can run on the device? Typically what happens is you'd only have a subset of applications on the device, only ones that the truck driver or the warehouse worker should be using. Not every application. They don't want the truck driver playing games on the device. They should be delivering packages and driving a truck, not necessarily playing Angry Birds. So the IT administrator will lock it down. They'll put security policies on the device that they can't bypass. So this mode that Google calls device owner enables that. And device owner mode basically is a set of APIs that a EMM or mobile device management vendor, somebody like AirWatch or Sodi or Mobile Iron or Maz 360, will develop to manage a device. And the idea here is that you've got a fleet of devices, thousands of devices. Rather than having to manually touch each device to configure it, this software could automatically provision each device, set the security policies, make sure they're up to date on policies and applications and things like that. If needed, they can wipe all the data on the device. If the device is lost, got stolen, they'll wipe that data so that data is not stolen. Another important thing is to do this seamlessly, right? What we call a silent application or silent security certificate installation. Again, if we have thousands of truck drivers or cashiers working with devices, they don't want each one of them to make the decision, should I install this application or not? So, Google has done it, we've also done it, so that you can install an application without user interaction. That's a little bit different than, in a consumer device. A consumer device, you intentionally want that user interaction. That's actually a security feature, that the application is being installed, it's accessing the network and accessing your contact cards. And you should ask yourself, why is this game accessing my contact cards? Right? Why is it accessing the network? What is it doing? right? So, but on the consumer side, on the enterprise side, again, that decision is not necessarily the end user, who probably doesn't know the details. It's the IT administrator. So they've configured it, they've allowed that application, and they'll install it silently so the user doesn't have to make the decision whether or not they should install things. So the ability to install applications and certificates silently is one of the big features that allows corporate devices to be managed. Another important thing is managing the Google accounts. We all get a new Android phone. First thing we do is we type in our Google account so we can log onto the phone. It does a nice job, log in. It can take all my data, all my applications that I've used on my previous phone and download them. Well, again, imagine if I've got thousands or tens of thousands of devices and I'm an administrator. How do I manage all of those usernames and passwords? What if somebody leaves the company? What do I do with that device? Is that device now a brick and I can't use it anymore? That was really a big barrier to people. About 2 years ago, Google came up with something they call managed Google Play accounts. The idea is that you could automatically generate an account per device. So an EMM, again, a device management application, could generate through a Google Play service, through a RESTful API, a unique account per device, not necessarily per user, and automatically deploy it to the device seamlessly. They typically will do it based on a serial number or some unique identifier on the device, generate a Google account that corresponds to that. The EMM will keep a database. Google doesn't know about that, doesn't know that correlation. So it might know that device number 123, right, is Google account, some random string, right? They seamlessly deploy to the device. It doesn't need a password. It'll log onto the device, and now we can access all the Google Play services. So now the administrator doesn't have to deal with all the headache of having to manage devices. This was a big step for people to be able to manage, Android devices in the enterprise. So you can imagine having to manage, lots of devices with lots of different usernames and passwords really became a big challenge. If you ever read the Google Terms of Services, you can actually have 10 devices per Google account. And once you go beyond that, it's probably won't break at 11, but if you go beyond that, strange things start to happen. They also do things security-wise, which is pretty interesting. If they saw that, today, right now I logged in from New York City, and 30 seconds later I'm logging in from Austin, Texas, they say something's wrong. How can it be in two places at the same time? So they detect it as a security threat. Well, what if I had 100,000 devices throughout the country and I was trying to use one Google account? Well, Google security would kick in and stop you letting you log in, rightfully so, because they're trying to protect consumers, not necessarily the enterprise. So the managed Google Play accounts has been a pretty significant factor in people, moving to Android for enterprise adoption. Jumping to security. We've all probably seen headlines, about security vulnerabilities. Most recent, the last couple of weeks, is Blueborn. How many people have heard about the Blueborn vulnerability? Okay. Yeah, so Blueborn was a series of vulnerabilities, basically through Bluetooth, not just on Android, but lots of different platforms, which would allow remote code execution, right? It's a fairly potentially dangerous situation because somebody could attack you and execute code on your phone, right, or your PC without you knowing about it. A lot of these make a lot of headlines. Heartbleed, stage fright, they kind of with catchy phrases. Some of them made public headlines. There's the screenshot I have there from the Today Show about the Heartbleed vulnerability. So, years ago, nobody knew about these things, right? They were kind of hidden in technical journals. They didn't make national news. With the Blueborn hit last week or 2 weeks ago, I think in one day I counted 100 emails from customers who were concerned about it. They didn't really know what it was, but they saw a lot of press and publicity about it, right? So we had to act quickly to try to fix it. Unfortunately, the bad guys also read about them, and then they figure out how to attack the systems. So it's a kind of a never-ending system. Some of these things are hype, some of them are real, right? They make great headlines to say that 100 million phones are vulnerable, right? Or all these things are vulnerable. The truth is, there's a lot of safeguards built into Android. We've added some additional ones that make it pretty safe. The questions we always get from enterprise Android customers, is Android safe, right? They're risking they're running their business on it. They want to make sure it's safe. So, a lot of this presentation are things that we've used to present to our enterprise customers to show them the great pains that Google has put in and that we've put in on top of that to make sure that their environments are safe. When I look at it, what are customers' security concerns? The first being leak of sensitive data. So things that are on device. Wi-Fi key is a great example. The pre-shared key, right? Imagine, enterprise, the password to get on their network. not only is that a security vulnerability, but if they have to change it, the logistics about doing that is really a pain, because it's not only on the phones, but laptops and things like that. If they had to change their keys, it's a pretty big undertaking. Customer data, patient data, things like that that are stored on the device, they want to protect. Denial of service. So they're buying our devices to be more efficient. They're running their business. If somebody could stop the device from working, they can prevent them from doing their job. A classic denial of service attack. So basically, the device is not doing the job because it's being compromised and it's too busy doing other things and it's not actually working on it. The other is, it could be a vector, it could be a way to get onto a network, unauthorized access. Right? These devices typically are on corporate networks, either through a wireless LAN or a cellular connection. Could somebody use that as a mechanism to get onto a corporate network and then gain other corporate information that way? So people are concerned about security and on the mobile devices, and we need to make sure that we're protecting them. We do it, I break it into kind of 3 different ways, 3 different levels that we're looking at from security. First thing is prevention, right? The basic premise here is if a harmful application can't run, it can't do any harm. Sounds pretty logical, right? Something can't run, can't do anything bad. So we put a lot of mechanisms in there to do that, as well as Android already has a lot. The second principle here is detection. If something does happen, can we detect this happens so somebody knows it's there and can take a countermeasure? And the third one is, as hard as we try, things happen, right? So keeping up with security updates is really important, right? And we're committed to doing that. Google is releasing security updates every 30 days, which has kind of been the industry norm. Apple does that. Microsoft has their Patch Tuesdays where they do it once a month. They release updates. A lot of recent vulnerabilities were like the WannaCry, which got a lot of vulnerability, a lot of the ransomware attack that was on Windows desktops, right? And it got a lot of attention because basically it would lock your computer and you'd have to pay a ransom to get the data back. Well, it turned out Microsoft had actually had a patch for that 3 or 4 months earlier. The people who were vulnerable were the people who didn't put the latest security patches in. So keeping up with updates is really an important factor there. Google, in the past, years ago, Android had a reputation not being too secure. They've put a significant investment in the last few years in terms of increasing, their security factors, their security. They publish an annual report. They do a security year in review. The link is on the bottom there. I would say, most security papers are usually pretty boring reads. This one is actually a pretty good read. It's pretty interesting, the different things that they've done. One of the big things that they do, people are always concerned about the Play Store, their application store, is, well, if I go to the App Store, how do I know that I'm not downloading something that's doing something malicious on my device? Well, they've put a significant effort into scanning applications, but not only do they scan the applications on the Play Store, they'll scan the applications on your device. So when you're connected to the network, it'll it'll periodically scan all the .apks, the application files on your device, looking for patterns of known malicious applications. Right? They'll also scan third-party websites. So there's lots of alternate places where you can get, applications of unknown origin. Some of them are legal, some of them are not legal. They'll just, they'll scan the web looking for .apk files, and they'll check them for known vulnerabilities. I would recommend anybody who downloads apps from those third-party sites shouldn't do them because you can't trust any of them. But Google, to make sure Android was more secure, took the initiative to scan those things. Typically, when they find a security vulnerability, when a researcher or somebody tells them there's a potential vulnerability, before they let anybody know, before they let us know as an OEM, they actually go through the Play Store and the third-party websites and the devices looking for any applications that might have taken advantage of that vulnerability. And if they find it, they'll delete it from the Play Store. They'll shut them down. So they know before they tell anybody, they basically prevented it. Because the idea is they don't want to tell people about it, before they have a patch in place for that. They do things like application sandboxing. So one application can't access the data from another application. They've required hardware-based encryption and hardware-based what they call a trusted execution environment. So they adhere with a trusted execution environment it's a dedicated processor within the main CPU that's secure, meaning if somebody roots the device, they can't get access to anything that's stored in this trusted processor. It's a separate processor that only does security-related functions, and you can't, even if you could probe it, you couldn't get the information out of it. They do things like verify boot, and I have a slide later to basically make sure nobody's modified the operating system. As I mentioned, they're committed to monthly security updates. What they've seen with all these things in place, a significant decrease in the percentage of harmful applications, potentially harmful applications that are on a device. I think it's less than 0.05%. So when they look, and Google's as being a numbers company and a data focused company, 0.05% of the devices that had access to the Play Store had a potentially harmful application on it, which is a pretty low number. And they've graphed it, and it goes down year over year. They've put together kind of a pretty comprehensive architecture that they call safety net for the various things that they do to protect the devices. I mentioned, the Verify apps, which basically scans applications looking for known vulnerabilities. But they also do analytics type things. So they look for trends. They look for applications that are going to, strange locations. Why are all these IP addresses sending data to some other country that they shouldn't be? They could do correlations between versions of an application and how often it connects to the Google server. So they keep track of, for example, the percentage of devices that will connect to, the Google Cloud every day, which is probably, I don't know the actual number, but I bet it's in, the high 90s in terms of percentage-wise. But they can correlate that says, well, devices that loaded this application yesterday, this version, only 30% connect. Well, I bet there's something wrong with that version of the application because a good percentage of the people who, once they loaded the application, stop connecting. So they can flag that as a potential vulnerability. They do hundreds of things like that, looking for trends and analytics and correlations to try to detect potentially harmful applications. A lot of things they don't tell us about, right? Because they're intentionally doing it. The example about how many people phoned home, so to speak, was one of the ones that they did tell us about. Another one is they have something they call Device Attestation API. The idea is as an application developer, if you want to know that you're working on a device that hasn't been compromised, how do you know? Right? If there's an API, somebody who compromises the device could change that API to always return true to say, hey, I'm a good device. What happens is, as an OEM, when we get our device certified by Google, they keep a signature of the device that they hash and they digitally sign, and it's stored on their server. At runtime, if you call this an API, there's a device attestation API that'll basically check that signature, send it to Google, and they'll verify that you're running on a known device. Things like Android Pay use that to make sure nobody rooted the device or modified the operating system of the device since it was shipped to know that it's a known trusted device. What's interesting is they told me the #1 application that's actually using this device attestation API was Pokemon Go. So you think about it, you think money is more important, but I guess the guys doing Pokemon Go thought people cheating in the game was more important than what we think Android Pay or things like that. But it's something I would encourage people to use if you're doing sensitive business applications or financial applications. Look into some of the safety net features, particularly the device attestation APIs. Right. As I mentioned, their numbers are pretty staggering. Right? They say over 1 billion devices that are protected because just the sheer number of Android devices are out there. They say over 400 million devices are scanned per day. I think this slide is probably a little dated, so it's probably even higher now. And they check 6 billion devices a day. So they have, not only are they running these applications on devices, they've got tens of thousands of virtual machines that are running emulators, looking at applications, looking for analytics and trends to see, are they doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and flagging them as potentially harmful applications. So, when we look at the headlines and all the things that are being done, the exploits to date have been, pretty minor. So, there's a difference between a vulnerability, which basically says there's a theoretical, a researcher has said there's a theoretical possibility that somebody could exploit this device, to somebody who's actually done it and exploited the device. So if we look at the stage fright vulnerability, which made a lot of headlines recently, which had to do with somebody sending a malformed MMS message to a device and being able to execute code, right? And a researcher in a lab, not a hacker, proved that it was theoretically possible to do. but nobody actually was able to actually exploit it. So while they patched it, it had made a lot of headline news and things like that, and the original headline said 95% of devices are vulnerable, which theoretically was correct, right? There were no confirmed exploits. It means nobody actually wrote code that took advantage of it, but it was theoretically possible. So they still patched it, went through all the right maneuvers, right? But it was still pretty safe because there was no net exploits of it. I'm not trying to say that everything is safe, don't worry about it. I'm just trying to say, so far, there haven't been really any main vulnerabilities here, and they've done a lot of good things, and they continue to do a lot of good things to make the platform as secure as possible. When I look at security, the way I like to look at it is what they call defense in depth, which is kind of a fancy way that security guys pull it for layers of defense. I always equate this to locks on your front door. So if you think about it, if you put one lock on your front door, somebody that bypasses that lock, it's pretty easy to get into your house. But if you've got a lock and a deadbolt and a chain and an alarm panel and a security camera, the more things you put there, the harder it is to get into your house. It's the same thing with security. If you just got one thing, whether it's encryption or something like that, once somebody gets past that, well, now they're on your device and they can do something bad. So it's a layered approach. I won't have time today to go through all the details here, but the basic idea, working from the top to the bottom, is first layer of defense is prevent unauthorized users from the device. And again, the main premise here is how do you prevent potentially harmful code from executing? If it can't execute, it can't do any harm. So first thing is prevent unauthorized users on the device through passwords and things like that. Second thing we can do is prevent installation of unauthorized applications. So typically, we'll have, Android has features and we have features to whitelist and blacklist applications. So it's the known applications that are allowed to run on an enterprise device, right? If somehow somebody gets on the device, they install an application, we can prevent it from launching. We have what we call our enterprise home screen, which is an alternate home screen, which only shows the icons of allowed applications. So even if somehow it got on the device, there's no icon, you actually can't launch it. If somehow you launched it, we actually have a blacklisting mechanism that will prevent it from executing. So again, somebody had to get the device there, install it, launch it, and execute it before it would actually do some harm. And we can block it at all these layers. So if somebody gets past that and it does run, well, then there's protections built into Android that prevent one application from having privilege it shouldn't have. And this is where sandboxing comes into play. So an application can't see the data from another application. So even though it runs, it's hard for you to see somebody else's data, so it's hard to steal it. They do a lot of things with protecting potential buffer overflow or stack overflow exploits. The one particular, and I won't go through all of them, is the address space layout randomization. So when you think about when an application loads into memory, right? People manipulate the stack and they try to execute code. Well, with the address space layout randomization, every time an app loads into memory, where it loads in memory is random. Where the stack is, where the heap is, where the code space is different every time, which makes it significantly more difficult for somebody writing an exploit to try to have code execute from a buffer overflow, which is actually, we talked about the stage fright, which was the main reason why nobody could actually exploit stage fright in the past, because even though they could actually execute code, where things were in memory was different every time. I'll never say it's impossible. People could figure out the randomization code or something like that, but it makes it significantly harder for people to exploit the device. Never impossible, but again, you got to get through all these different layers. And the last layer here is, detecting, if something does happen, how do you detect that it's happened, and then take the appropriate countermeasures. So, for example, detecting somebody's rooting the device and then erasing all the data on the device. So, you can't do any harm because then, there's no data at that point anymore. So that's kind of the last layer of defense. And I'll go kind of quickly because I'm running tight on time. But when we lock down a device, in enterprise devices, a combination of what Google provides in Android and what we've provided in our MX extensions is be able to configure only the components that you need. So, for example, disabling the USB port if a customer isn't using it, disabling the browser, disabling the Android debug bridge. These are all ways where obviously on your consumer phone you want all these things on, but if I'm deploying to, a truck driver who's delivering packages, they probably don't need Android debug bridge on. They probably necessarily don't need USB port. It's just an open port that would allow people to be able to copy files on the device and potentially doing something harmful. We can disable recording devices, the camera. NFC, people don't realize you can transfer files back and forth using NFC, so that's one of the things we've configured. These are all optional. They're configurable by the device administrator to be able to control down the device. The idea here is least privilege, meaning only enable what's needed, and everything that's not needed, disable. Lots of security exploits come through the web browser. As you can imagine, various websites do potentially harmful things. Many customers don't use the browser, so we say, well, disable the browser. Right? Lots of people call me up, hey, this new exploit in the browser, how do I protect against it? Are you using the browser? No. Well, just disable the browser and don't worry about it. That's probably the simplest thing. Now, if you are using the browser, well, now you have to, make sure you have all the latest patches and you take the right precautions. But if you're not using it, just disable it, and then you've got less to worry about. And typically, nobody's using everything, so there's always a combination of things that they can do. I had mentioned our threat management system. So one of the things that we've added is, in the background, we have an active threat management system. So basically, it's a service that runs in the background, doesn't need network connectivity, and detects threats, for example, like somebody rooting the device, like somebody removing the device management agent, and it has a bunch of countermeasures that are programmable. So the threats are along the rows, and the countermeasures are along the columns in this example. So, for example, you could say if we detect the device is rooted, factory reset the device, which basically brings it to out of factory case where there's no data on the device, and that's all configurable. You can lock the device, you can send a message, things like that. So that gives people kind of the last resort that says something happened. Let's take a countermeasure and let somebody know about it, so at least no harm is done. Security updates. So doing a security updates often, right, obviously is the right thing to do, because the shorter the period of time, that the bad guys know about it, the less likelihood they're going to do something bad. There's a lot of logistics to get this done, right? It's hard. The updates come from lots of different sources. So a lot of the components are open source, a lot of security researchers, the Android team. They provide it to manufacturers who will do an update every 30 days. There's a lot of testing that's involved there. And then, even when we give it to customers, well, they got to test their applications, so that even becomes a challenge. We've committed to actually provide security updates every 30 days, but Google typically does it for 2 to 3 years, which is the typical life of a consumer operating system, a consumer phone. In our devices, people use them for 5 or 10 years, which is a pretty long life cycle. So we've actually committed to provide security updates for up to 7 years, which is a pretty long time and a big effort, but it keeps people up to date on security. One of the other things that I mentioned earlier is, Google has mandated full disk encryption, right? Starting with Marshmallow and newer, right? At the factory, on the first boot technically, when we build a device, it gets encrypted. It actually uses the hardware back key store, the trusted execution environment, or ARM calls the trust zone, where the key is stored, so nobody can pull it out of memory. It generates a master key that's hashed with a salt on a user PIN and password to encrypt all data on the device. Most new processors, typically the ones that we use, actually have special instructions for accelerating the encryption, so the performance isn't really compromised. So there's really no necessary downside to encrypting all data on the device. In the past, it was all software-based, and slower processors, you could see a noticeable performance decrease by having full disk encryption. Typically, doing it at the factory basically means there's no data there. Typically, if you encrypt the disk when there's data on it, it takes a long time. But if there's nothing there, it's relatively quick, and then as you add data, it gets encrypted as you're adding it to the device. Okay, so they're giving me the end. So really just kind of summarize, Android's a pretty secure operating system. Recommended that people adopt the best security practices, whitelist and blacklist the applications that they want, disable unneeded interfaces, control access to settings so people can't reconfigure them, and plan on regular security updates. So thank you. And if we have time for a question or two, tell me now. So, but we'll be here if you have questions afterwards, and Zebra has a booth where myself or colleagues can answer questions later or tomorrow. Okay. Thank you very much.